Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new self-titled Black album from Weezer. This has been an album that I've been anticipating to some extent for a good while now. Weezer started teasing this thing not long after they dropped their white self-titled album back in 2016. That was an album I really loved, and of course, considering at the time it seemed like Weezer were, kind of returning to form with the quality of their music, that I was hoping the Black Album would just be another solid album for the band. And not only that, but the band was teasing some pretty interesting information regarding this album as well, saying it was going to be their darkest album, or at least a dark album in general. It was going to be their first album to have like swear words on it. I was kind of interested to see what this was going to be. I expected it to be a darker counterpart to the White Album we got in 2016, which was generally speaking a really upbeat, summery album that, like I said before, I really found myself enjoying a whole lot. Though Weezer fans know that the Black Album isn't exactly what we got next after that white self-titled album. In 2017, Weezer dropped Pacific Daydream, their next studio album, which was made very clear that it wasn't a replacement for the Black Album or like what the Black Album was supposed to be, but rather it was just a completely different project that the band was able to make while also working on the Black Album, that the Black Album would be coming eventually. Pacific Daydream was an album that, like a lot of people, I didn't care for all too much. There were like a couple decent moments on it, but for the most part it just sounded like this really laid back, Beach Boys inspired album that the band kind of threw together while they were working on the Black Album. Like many people, I was hoping that maybe, Pacific Daydream was like the weaker cuts that they were working up, and that the Black Album was going to have all the good stuff on it. 2018 was not an uneventful year for the band either, as despite the fact that the band didn't drop any full-length albums, the band had a lot of success with their cover of Toto's Africa, which kind of led the band to get a whole new slew of younger, more meme-focused fans to some extent, and the band answered this portion of their fan base with the Teal self-titled album they dropped earlier this year. A collection of covers that I thought overall was pretty lifeless, pretty uninteresting, not a project that I have ever desired to return to in the future. But, despite the fact that the cover portion of Weezer's career wasn't one I was particularly hot on, I was just kind of hoping that, like Pacific Daydream, was just this other offshoot that was there to kind of, give fans something to consume while waiting for this Black Album. The only thing that had me kind of excited for the Black Album was that the first couple of singles from this thing, Can't Knock the Hustle and Zombie Bastards, were pretty, at the very least, decent tracks in my opinion, and I was hoping that the album would be more of what we were getting on these tracks, if not even better. But still, I went into this new album not necessarily expecting to like it or dislike it, really. Essentially, I just didn't get my hopes up too high, really. If this thing was going to disappoint me, I didn't want it to be a lot, pretty much. And after listening to this album a good amount of times, I could say that overall, I'm a lot more mixed on this album than having either a really strong positive or negative opinion on it. There's aspects to this album that I like. There's also aspects to this album I don't care for. One of the biggest things about this album that kind of stood out to me when listening to it is that the whole teased notion that this was going to be a darker counterpart to White really is not true in the slightest. This album isn't a very dark album, not even by Weezer standards. It's not a dark album. In fact, at times it even sounds a bit more upbeat and happy than White was. I mean, White Album, like I said, it was pretty summery and upbeat, but it did have some more, darker moments in there, like Endless Bummer, for example. You really don't get any of those moments here on this album, which is a little disappointing, I guess, but I mean, considering how much stuff happened in between the White Album and this thing, I guess it's really not that much of a surprise that this thing ended up sounding completely different than what was initially teased. The only thing that did make it into this album that was initially teased were some swear words, which really doesn't make a difference to the overall quality of the album. The album's beginning is probably the strongest part of it, really. The first 4 tracks from this thing that were all released as singles, I think, are some of the best on the album overall. Can't Knock the Hustle, which opens this thing, is a track that, when I initially heard it several months ago, when it was released as a single, I was kind of mixed on it overall, but I've grown to like it a lot since then, and hearing it in the context of the album, I do still really like this thing. I like the really ridiculous, lyrics throughout this thing, especially on the chorus. I know with Weezer and their lyrics, they do have a tendency to, tread that border between corny and kind of, not necessarily clever, but enjoyably, corny, I guess you could say. And this is definitely a track that's kind of on that border, but I feel like it definitely is more enjoyable than it is not, especially when it comes to the lyrics. The track is also really catchy, and that certainly helps it stand out as well. Zombie Bastards that follows it is another cut that I think is pretty decent overall. It wasn't one that I also cared for all too much when I first heard it, but over time it also has grown on me a bit. Not as much as Can't Knock the Hustle, but still, I think it's a decent track. I like the more laid-back atmosphere that this track has going for it. Once again, it's a pretty catchy track as well, and the lyrics on this thing are so stupidly just dumb and nonsensical that it kind of works. The track High as a Kite that follows this one is probably the best song on the album overall. It's the closest that any track on this thing comes to sounding like something off a White Album. I really like the kind of summery feel this track has going for it. Once again, it has a massive, kind of bombastic and really catchy chorus to it that I really enjoy. And overall, it's just a cut that has a lot of what I like about Weezer in it. It has a very fun, carefree feel to it, but it never crosses the line into just downright cringy, corny territory. The track Living in LA that follows High as a Kite is one that, like a lot of the songs on this album, was one I initially didn't care for all too much, but over time it did grow on me a fair bit. It's definitely a poppier track on this album, but I still think it ends up working rather nicely. It's a pretty catchy track. I mean, it doesn't do anything all too crazy or out there. It's not one of Weezer's best or anything, but it's a decently catchy, enjoyable pop song. And, in the context of some of the weaker moments on this album, I was fine with this track overall. After this fourth track, the album becomes a bit more inconsistent overall. I never really feel like the album manages to pick up the pace quite as much as it does in these first four tracks, really. These singles that come right at the beginning of this thing are the most enjoyable part of the album overall. After this, you have some decent tracks, you have some not-so-good tracks. It's a mixed bag, pretty much. One of the better moments is definitely the track I'm Just Being Honest. I thought the lyrics on this track were really great and hilarious. At the beginning of the song, Rivers is talking about hearing this band's CD that they gave him, and he has to stop halfway through because it just sounds so bad. And then in the second verse, he's talking about this person who just cut their hair, and he tells them that he liked them better before. And essentially in the track, he's just kind of dealing with the problem of being too honest, I guess, with these people. And I just found it was really funny overall. I like his really dry delivery of all of it. Overall, the lyrics on this track are probably some of my favorite lyrics on the entire album overall. They were just really fun, really quirky, in a way that I really enjoyed. It's just a shame that, everything else about the track isn't anywhere near as interesting or fun, really. I mean, Rivers' vocal performance on the track is pretty decent as well. Like I said, I like his kind of dry delivery here during the verses. However, the instrumental isn't super interesting. Yeah, just based on sound alone, it's not one of the standout tracks necessarily. It's really the lyrics that are carrying a lot of the goods that are on this track. And while you'll get some songs with funny lyrics like that one, there's also some tracks on here where the lyrics just suck pretty much. Like Piece of Cake, for example. It's this really poppy track with kind of nonsensical lyrics. However, they're not kind of nonsensical in a good way where it just feels really fun. It just kind of feels all over the place, not really all that coherent, just not all that enjoyable. And then you have the track Too Many Thoughts in My Head, which is probably my least favorite song on the entire album, due greatly to the lyrics on this thing that are just really nonsensical all over the place, but not in a way that's really fun, like in Zombie Bastards, more so in a way that just feels really cobbled together, and it's just not all that enjoyable. For example, you'll get lyrical gems on this thing like, I'm so high on cookies, it's insane, and there's not really much context to that track, that lyric. It just kind of exists. And then you also have lyrics like overwhelmed by Netflix options, and this is just one example on the album where I feel like the band is trying to not necessarily pander, but maybe relate to the younger portion of their fan base, maybe some of those fans they picked up thanks to their Africa cover and the Teal album and all of that. But it just comes across as really forced to me, and I just didn't like it overall. The rest of the track outside of the lyrics, I guess, is like okay enough. Like the performances on it are alright. but they're not really all that standout either. Yeah, it's definitely my least favorite song on the album. The lyrics do play a big part as to why that is the case. The track "The Prince That Wanted Everything" is just a pretty forgettable song overall. I don't have much to say about it, despite having heard it multiple times at this point. And towards the back end of the album, you get the track "Byzantine," which I think is one of the better songs on the album. One that definitely grew on me a bit more with time. Not necessarily because I didn't really care for it all that much at the beginning. Initially, I didn't really have any strong feelings towards it, but with time, it grew on me to be one of the more quirky cuts from this album overall. I like the kind of upbeat feel this track has going for it. Some of the quirky lyrics on this one I think happen to work a bit better than they do on some of the tracks I mentioned previously. Overall, it's just a bit of a quirky, fun song overall. I mean, there's not too much to it really. Once again, it's not one of Weezer's best or anything, but it is one of the more enjoyable cuts on the album overall. And in the closing track to this album, for some reason the band decides to throw "California Snow" onto this thing, which was released several months ago, even before the first official singles from this album were dropped. I did do a track review for this song where I didn't really care for the track. Initially, this thing was tied to the soundtrack of some movie. I don't remember which one. Not super important anyways. But I, like many people in that track review, just kind of, didn't care for the track. But at the same time, no one really cared all that much because it was just some song they made tied to a film. We were all like, just get it out of your system, Weezer. Just have better stuff on the Black Album. And then this is on the Black Album. And I still don't care for the track all too much. It does suffer from a lot of the problems that exist on the rest of this project. Kind of odd lyric choices, a very overproduced sound, which I will touch on a bit more later on. And I will give it this. The track has grown on me a little bit since I initially reviewed it overall. I feel a lot more just mixed on this track now than I did before when I felt like I didn't like the track overall. There's certainly aspects to this track that I, after giving it even more listens, can say I think are at least decent. I like the kind of synth part that runs throughout this thing. I think it's kind of interesting. The chorus on this track is, fairly catchy. I mean, I'm not sure if at this point it's just Stockholm Syndrome, and I actually deep down really hate this song, and I've just listened to it so many times that I've forced myself to like it. But, I think Weezer have released worse songs. There's worse songs on this album than this one, to be honest. I'm just kind of baffled that it ended up making the album because, it was just kind of an odd release of a song. I do also want to note that I think it's a pretty terrible closer for the album. I mean, the song itself I think is just pretty meh. But as a closer, I don't think it works very nicely. I mean, when you have a closer to an album, you expect it to kind of, tie things up. But that doesn't happen here on this track. It just feels like another song in the track listing. Nothing about it feels final or conclusive. It's just kind of there, like another song, and then it's over, and then the album's over with it. I mean, if you were listening to this album, not paying attention to the track listing and how many tracks had gone by, you wouldn't really get the feeling that this is the end of the album when listening to this song. I mean, it's not the worst song on the album, but it's far from one of the best. One of my biggest problems with this album, outside of any of the individual tracks on this thing, is just that a lot of the songs on this thing sound a little bit overproduced and just kind of cheap sounding, I guess you could say. It's different from an album like White or Everything Will Be Alright in the End, or even some of the band's older records that have a more natural feel to them. Everything on this album just feels a little bit more overproduced. The instrumentals feel a bit tackier, a bit cheaper, a bit more flimsy overall, a bit less memorable as well. I mean, a lot of the songwriting on this thing is, typical Weezer, for better or worse, but I just feel like the overall sound of this thing just isn't all that great. And that's the thing about this album, really. It's not a terrible Weezer album. In fact, I think I feel more positive towards this album than negative at the end of the day. But at the same time, it's not a great one either. It's better than Pacific Daydream, but it's still much worse than White, Everything Will Be Alright in the End, and of course the band's classic material too. It's just kind of in this weird middle ground. If this reminds me of any album from the band, I've heard a lot of people compare this to Red, but personally I disagree with that. I think that this album most resembles Make Believe, and the fact that the band is trying to clearly go for a wider audience with this album. Now they've acquired a lot of new fans thanks to their covers that they dropped last year and this year. And I feel like at parts of this album, they're trying to pander that portion of their fan base, though I do think on this album it ends up sounding a lot better than Make Believe ended up sounding. I would say this is still a significantly better release than that album was. If you're a Weezer fan, I'm sure you've already heard this. I'm sure you already have your opinion on this thing, whether or not you love it, or you hate it, or you're just kind of mixed on it. But to those of you out there who aren't Weezer fans necessarily, or are maybe more casual Weezer fans, I would say give the first 4 tracks or so of this thing a listen for sure. If you like it, maybe explore the rest of the album. If you don't like those, probably not going to like the rest of the album, because I definitely feel it drops off in quality after those first 4 songs. And yeah, as a pretty big Weezer fan myself, I am pretty, I guess, satisfied in some sense of the word with this release. It's not as great an album as I was expecting it to be coming off of White, but after the couple of years we've had in between that album's release and this one, you know, Black ended up sounding about what I expected it to sound like. Like I said, I didn't come into this thing with super high hopes necessarily. I didn't come into it expecting to hate it either. And I walked out of it not hating it or loving it. So I guess I set my expectations at a pretty appropriate level of hype for this thing. Which is why I probably ended up enjoying a fair amount of this thing while also disliking a fair amount of this thing. So yeah, that's all there is really to it when it comes to my own opinion on this album. But it is just my own opinion. In fact, if you have an opinion of your own on this thing, whether or not you love it, hate it, or agree with me, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. I'm also going to link my review of the Teal album in the description down below if you would like to check that out. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.